I've never been a naturally strong athlete. It's for that reason I've had to put in so much effort into learning about every aspect of training. In my late teens, I was certainly not one of these climbers who was already knocking out 9As. It was more like 80. Not bad, but I'm sure you agree that there's a huge gap between 80 and 9A. In fact, my improvement levelled off in my early 20s around 8B sport, 7C plus bouldering for quite a few years. Then I made a jump in around 18 months from about 8B, maybe I'd done one 8B plus at my absolute limit, to 9A. In this episode, I'm going to tell you about what I did and why it may be less likely to work for you than it did for me. And of course, I'll suggest what you might do instead to reach the same point. It's a very simple story, like nearly all things in training are, of lining up the right circumstances consistently over time and then reassessing them as you progress to the next stage. The stage of my climbing which triggered the jump in ability started in the spring of, I think, 2004. I climbed a lot of 7C plus boulders, maybe one or two 8As, and I could red point most 8B sport routes, but I would take a long time over it. I think I managed one or two 8B pluses that really suited me. Like everyone, I really wanted to keep progressing in my climbing, and so I just kept on getting on gradually harder and more ambitious projects. One which I started trying and I was really motivated for was an 8C project which a friend Dave had bolted but had left, and he said I could try it. I could walk to it from my house, and so I tried it all the time and I got it completely wired. I could climb up to the crux, fall off, and then pull back on and climb to the top, but I spent the entire spring trying to improve on that, and it became painfully obvious that I'd hit a wall. As an aside, this is why trying really ambitious projects is so important in my opinion. Once you get really emotionally committed to them, you don't want to give up, and you're also forced to see the hard reality of not being good enough. And this is a deeply uncomfortable place to be, and it's exactly that mindset of deep discomfort that brings about the circumstances for change. It gives you the fire, the courage basically to abandon your tightly held habits. And a second aside, this is where it gets tricky if you're working with a coach. You might ask a coach or work by yourself to optimize each aspect of your training routine while working within certain life constraints, and that's fine. Everyone should do that. So if that was all there was to it, why doesn't everyone keep progressing? Improving at any sport is always about both optimizing within your constraints and constantly challenging those constraints. It's a courageous climbing coach that starts telling you to leave your job, move house to the mountains, turn off your phone and all that kind of thing. You might feel that that's not what you've employed them to do. Fair enough. My point here though is that perhaps that's exactly what you should employ them to do. This is why the very first statement in my book 9 out of 10 Climbers, when you open it up, is this book is for anyone who's ready to challenge and to change their habits. But back to the 8C. In my case, I was confident that I had absolutely the best sequence for the moves. There was no better way that I could climb it. I couldn't climb it faster, I couldn't skip more clips or find any better conditions. I was just not strong enough. And when I was walking home from the crag in May, during I think the last day of good conditions to try it, I decided that I had to have a proper strategy for the summer. I just spent maybe the past 6 or maybe more years spending a huge amount of time climbing outdoors, doing countless routes in all conceivable styles. Hold that thought. I did feel quite confident that I was technically and tactically a really solid climber. However, one thing that I'd never really done was fingerboarding. I'd done plenty of bouldering inside and outside, and I've done a fair bit of campus board, but I'm not even certain that my local climbing centre even had a fingerboard at that time. I can't actually remember. I felt two things really strongly. First, it was obvious that some sort of fundamental change in my routine was going to be needed. Secondly, given that I was stuck in this plateau, I really didn't have much to lose by trying something new. And that nothing to lose mindset is something that I've come back to more in recent years, and I've made further jumps in my climbing ability, and I'll discuss those in other episodes. You might want to subscribe if you want to see those. So I decided that I would not only start to fingerboard, but I would really do it properly. I put up a single campus rung in my door frame, which cost £4. And I just started a routine which I don't remember putting a great deal of effort into planning. Each day I did a fingerboard workout for around 30 minutes, consisting of about 10 minutes warm up, followed by 5 max hangs of around 5 to 10 seconds each, 4 fingers open hand, 5 hangs half crimp, and 5 hangs 3 finger drag, and perhaps a couple of 2 finger hangs to finish. And then I walked around to Dumbarton Rock and I did endurance circuits on an eliminate circuit that I had. I had one very low intensity circuit, maybe around 6B plus, although it felt harder than that when it was in the sun, and a harder one that was maybe 7C plus or 8A. If the conditions were hot and greasy, I did the easier one. If the conditions were cooler, I did the harder one. On the easy one, I did possibly 2 stints of 40 minutes on the wall, going round and then shaking out on a really good shakeout for quite a long time. On the harder one, I just did exactly the same, but it was just a harder effort. And then in the late evening, I did a 1 hour run at a super gentle pace, mainly just to relax. I did that 6 days a week from the middle of June to the start of October. And then I only took a day off if I was going trad climbing. That summer I maybe did a handful of Mountain E6s on site and a couple of other new routes. So that was the intervention. I don't remember it feeling very hard at all at the time. And when you break it down, it's only a minute and a half of high intensity work per day in the fingerboard session. Beyond the first 6 weeks, I barely noticed any improvement on the fingerboard, so much so that I was thinking of abandoning the routine. Thankfully I didn't. I'll never forget the first cold day of October that year when I went back on the 8C project. I was climbing on my own on a shunt. If you haven't seen my video of how I work routes on my own, I'll link to the video here. The first move was kind of an awkward jump, and so it's not really that nice to do on the shunt. So I pulled on the second move of the route, and on my first try I climbed right to the chain. My mind was completely blown, and I'll never forget just sitting on the rope at the chain, taking it in, that not only was I imminently going to do this route, but I was thinking of all the other possibilities that this had opened up. Within the week I'd gone back with a partner and done the first ascent of that 8C, and that winter I did my first Font 8Bs, and the following year I did my first E11 trad route and then my first 9A sport route. A key point is that not really that much had changed, I don't think, about my climbing technique and tactics. It was just that my raw finger strength was higher. There's no getting around it. Finger strength is a core ingredient of climbing performance, and its importance can't be underestimated, but it can be overestimated. That's arguably the more important point in this post. Hopefully the first point is obvious, that it's a really good idea to have and use a fingerboard several times a week, and if you don't already do that. But thankfully most climbers do that already. By the time I wrote my first book, 9 out of 10 Climbers, around 2010, I could already see that some climbers were declining in their movement ability on rock and their tactics, as the fashion in training had shifted more towards climbing walls that keep you inside more away from the rock, and more towards basic strength training in general. And since that time, I think that tendency has only got more common. I do think that the general standard of finger strength has increased over the years in climbers in general, but the ability to get up gnarly, devious, technical pieces of rock has maybe not improved at the same rate. Maybe it's even declined for some climbers. Therefore, if you are the climber who've already played your fingerboard week in, week out for years card, then you can't duplicate it. The card you've still got to play is to do what I'd already done, which is to go outside and climb 1,000 routes between E1 and E4, for example. The downside of this is that it takes time, but an upside of that is it's a lot more fun than fingerboarding. Really, like, a proper climbing apprenticeship is a complete blast. It gives you memories that you have for life. And for fingerboarding, you have to actually write down every workout because they're so easy to forget. There's also maybe some of you are watching this video still sitting in a chair rather than watching it while hanging off your fingerboard in your doorframe, like you could be. I know there are some of these people. Last month I had an email from someone in a far-flung corner of the world who had heard me mention this story elsewhere and decided he would do the same as me. He worked out that in the summer I must have done about 100 fingerboard sessions, which is probably about right. So he printed off a grid with 120 squares and stuck it to his fridge, and he ticked off every fingerboard workout as he went through them. And afterwards he went back to an 8A he'd been on, and he told me that where he could barely hang on the edges to clip while just doing the moves, he could actually rest on those same holds, and it just felt so much easier. And so he climbed his first 8A. It's absolutely brilliant when this stuff works. So I would conclude by saying, climb countless routes, serve your technical apprenticeship. You can't reach your potential in climbing without it. Hang the fingerboard in the doorway, then hang off it for years. You can't reach your potential without that raw strength either. Put the two together and you're flying.